So you may be wondering, how did I get involved in the high-stakes game that is audio podcasting? And I thought perhaps the best way to start off this podcast was to introduce how I got involved in podcasting from the very beginning. This is a somewhat tortured tale of failed partnerships and failed delivery methods and a series of toings and froings, but as I have the luxury in this format of talking for an extended period of time, I thought I might as well introduce how this whole thing came about. Now, I was born in a place called Adelaide in South Australia. I was born with a cleft palate, various other physical abnormalities, and speech therapy was very important in my early childhood. And I also had a particular proclivity to record things, to record interviews with people, with family members. From age about 3 on, whenever I had a microphone and a tape recorder, I would typically be asking probing questions and just getting a sense of the inner workings of the mind. That's the thing that I loved about audio in particular, was that you didn't get distracted by the visuals. You could just start painting a picture with words, or at least encouraging others to paint a picture with words. When I first discovered audio podcasting, the main concern that I had was associated with the quality of equipment that I had. And this fell by the wayside pretty quickly because I bought a small MP3 pocket recorder and then just started recording my podcasts with that. And the audio was very rough and ready. I used TalkShoe and Blog Talk Radio initially and just utilized whatever technology I could get my hands onto, particularly associated with collaborative audio efforts. Now, my first podcast, I think, was called Barbelai's Log from memory, and that was probably 3 weeks worth of audio recordings that I took to and from my walk to work. I lived in Las Vegas at the time in an apartment complex. My walk to work was typically about 15 minutes, and I thought this was a really interesting environment to do audio recording. I also had a particularly challenging experience because the railroad tracks, I didn't walk, well, I crossed the railroad tracks at the road, but then walked along the railroad tracks a sufficient distance. So when the train came past, I wasn't actually on the railroad tracks. So it was probably about 10 feet from the railroad tracks. But there were various homeless folk that lived in the environment that I walked through. And there was a horrible experience that I had with a viscerated cat, where they placed the viscerated cat in a bag on the railroad tracks that I discovered on, I think, probably my walk to work. So Barbelai's Log was a means of audio narrating the experiences that I had. I did take some YouTube footage of the walk to work as well, because I just thought it was such it was an interesting environment. It was like an industrial part of Las Vegas where the apartments were kind of surrounded by industrial buildings that did a variety of different things. They weren't all slot machine related. In fact, I think very few of them were slot machine related. It was mainly older style industries. So I started doing that, and I don't even think I maybe put 1 or 2 of those out, and then I remember iTunes didn't continue the feed, and that was a bit of a downer. But then I started recording Ape Reality. Did I do Bio first, or did I do Ape Reality first? I can't recall which I did which first. I think I probably did Ape Reality first. And that was an audio podcast associated with my developments of my project Noble Ape. So at the time, there were, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so similar developers of software that created environments, and there was a small community, and I used Ape Reality as a means of talking about my own personal experiences developing Noble Ape, but also coming to this country. I mean, I started audio podcasting when I arrived in the US. It was a means of describing some of the nuances, some of the strange things that I saw, in particular with regards to all the curious affiliations associated with science and atheism and all these kind of things just made no sense to me. Kind of fundamentalist atheists and people that were very critical because my project Noble Ape, one of the guys that worked on it was Hindu, another guy that worked on it was a Christian. I mean, I didn't really care what people's belief systems were if they were contributing source code. It didn't really, I don't know, I didn't think it changed the quality of the code that was being submitted at all. So that was the toings and froings. The Ape Reality Podcast is still a feed that I maintain. I still put stuff in the Ape Reality Podcast. I might even put this audio in the Ape Reality Podcast. And the Bio podcast initially was very much associated with interviews. It was associated with interviewing academics and simulation authors and occasionally artists and philosophers that had contributed to this field, which is loosely called artificial life. You might want to call it kind of bottom-up artificial intelligence. There's a whole way of describing this thing. But anyway, that then became a podcast called Biota Live, which was a call-in show where these academics and various visionaries could call and participate. And that audio is still all available. In fact, university students go back and listen to it periodically, and I get emails about it. But the problem with Biota Live was that the 5 or so main contributors, other than myself, all went off and did other things. So it kind of came to a natural conclusion when other people went and joined startups or went to Google or did a variety of things, which just meant that they couldn't talk about their artificial life development anymore. So that was the end of Biota Live. But at that point, I'd taken the same format, which was a call-in show, fundamentally, and created Model Rail Radio. Now, before Model Rail Radio, if I can get the chronology correct, there was a podcast called The Best Damn Podcast Ever, and I edited maybe, I don't know how many shows I edited, maybe 20, 25 shows, maybe 15, who knows, some number of shows, to the point where I got very good at podcast editing. And that was a period of time where I was very interested in how people actually promoted podcasts. If people were producing content, how would this content reach people? Like, how could you take the creator's content and make sure that it reached the most people? And I tried a various set of promotional things. I mean, through this period of time, I'd used T-shirts very heavily. There were Noble Ape T-shirts that I'd send out frequently to folks that participate in the Biota podcast. And I started looking at various promotional means through working on the Best Damn Podcast Ever. But there's a difficulty associated with, so there seem to be kind of 3 tiers, and usually I do all 3 tiers. There's production, which typically means like ownership, and then there's the editing part, which I typically do as well. And then there's the content or talent part, which I'm a participant in, usually as a co-host or something like that, or a host. But these 3 tiers are very different. If you actually edit a podcast, you get a very intimate sense of the podcast recording, and you also get to work with the talent. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because certainly with the Best Damn Podcast Ever, they just had me doing like vast quantities of editing that I wouldn't normally want to do. And they also had this strange censorship model, which meant that I really didn't want to do the level of censorship that they were asking for. And there was a lot of tension. And also there was a kind of work ethic problem. I just didn't feel there was kind of compatibility of the work ethic. So I stepped away from that podcast. They weren't particularly happy. I wasn't particularly happy either, but I stepped away. Through that period of time, however, I also, and this will lead into some other chain here, through this period of time, I made contact with a few people that had been associated broadly with, I guess, the Jackass franchise, but really just people who I thought had a similar work ethic, were roughly of my age group. Also had connections with Australia, which was really important. And I started communicating with them. And through this period of time as well, I don't know how the chronology fits together, but they were starting a podcast as well. So I gave them some assistance associated just with technical stuff that I did and kind of kept in contact with them. And through this period of time as well, I also started being talent on a podcast, which I think at the time was called the CWF Gamecast. And I did a bunch of like small, like 1 or 2 or 3 recording talent spots with a bunch of other podcasts as well through that period of time. I'd appear and talk about artificial life and occasionally talk about Noble Ape and occasionally talk about Biota. And I was just like a talking person that was on podcasts through that period of time as well. The CWF Gamecast, I probably recorded, 15 podcasts with the gentleman that hosted it, and then there was a bit of a falling out. I need to take a step back and actually describe what the CWF Gamecast was about. The CWF Gamecast was a podcast about role-playing games and, to a lesser extent, war games, these kind of things, and the host was very interested in getting sponsors involved. And one of the sponsors of the podcast took exception to not really a negative review, but a review that I gave of a game that was, advertised in the sponsor's magazine. There was all this kind of strange blowback. And I thought at that time, this was a hobby and an interest of mine associated with miniatures and history and wargaming and things like that. But I just wasn't really interested in sponsorship. So through this period of time as well, I started another podcast. I don't even think I've talked about Model Rail Radio, so maybe I should start with Model Rail Radio. I had a call-in show called By Little Live, and then I transferred that format to model railroading. Now, I did a bit of an assessment at the time. I worked out that there were no model railroading podcasts with a degree of plurality. There were a couple of model railroading podcasts at the time, but they had their own particular niches, and none of them were really opening up to this notion that there are many tens of thousands of people that create these train layouts to a level of detail, a level of interest, that they're actually quite interesting folks to talk to. So Model Rail Radio came out of the call-in format, where it grew dramatically initially. In fact, it grew dramatically continuously. It's been an almost exponential growth to a linear growth, but still, it's growth. And in terms of a format that people absolutely love talking about model railroading, Model Rail Radio did very, very well and continues to do very well. So that podcast was there. And through the period of time that Biota was finishing up, a gentleman contacted me called Heron Stone, and he and I recorded a podcast for about 7 years, a weekly podcast for about 7 years. There was an 18-month hiatus through that, but that podcast was called Stone Ape. And Stone Ape continued through to November last year. And when Stone Ape concluded, I pretty well concluded the Biota podcast, kind of officially/unofficially. And I also had another podcast. It's very difficult to keep track of all these, but let's just bear with me, please, called Short Funk. And Short Funk, I recorded more than 700 episodes. It was a daily podcast. It was taking podcasting to another extreme. It was doing a daily podcast format where I would talk about any topic that entered my head, and I was typically recording 3 to 9 minutes. I think that was the agreed upon time associated with Short Funk. Stone Ape ended very abruptly. Stone Ape ended, well, there were a series of problems with Stone Ape. The first thing was the last election, the last US election. The co-host, Heron Stone, appeared to be somewhat sympathetic associated with the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. And I'm more than apolitical. I really think that the political parties in this country are just an anomaly of any possible form of reason. And in particular, candidate Clinton and candidate Trump struck me as two extremely unsavory figures, and in fact represented a satire that I wanted to talk about more directly associated with the political system. So the fact that this was unpalatable to my co-host and as well, I had to do a lot of work around that period of time too. So I work for Netflix. That's my day job. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But that meant that I was unable to record on a weekly basis with Stone Ape. So there were a combination of factors. I think we were getting on each other's nerves by the end. But the political aspect, the infrequency due to work, and just that we were getting on each other's nerves, the podcast concluded. Heron Stone pulled the plug on Stone Ape, and I kind of said, fine, enough, good, let's move on with our lives. And that was the end of Stone Ape. And it made me reflect very heavily that I've had great difficulty finding long-term collaborators. I've had collaborators that I've worked with for 6 months. I've had collaborators that I've worked with for 3 years. But Heron Stone was probably the longest collaborator. Although I've got folks like Bruce Damer and people like Larry Yeager who are in the artificial life community. Heron Stone was the longest weekly collaborator that I had worked with. And I think it's very difficult, particularly when you come to a country like the US. You're not an American. You'll never be an American. You're completely removed from a series of the standard components that makes an American, which will be an interesting theme that we'll explore through these podcast recordings. But you come to this thing, and you don't have to find collaborators. I mean, you can do monologues, and monologues are going to be the name of the game here. But you have to find like-minded folk on some level. And on a variety of levels, I find it really difficult to find people in the broader community that I can gel with for some length of time. I think Heron and I, we had delimited boundaries. Now, Heron, through the recording, was in his late 60s, early 70s. There are a series of really strange aspects to Stone Ape. I recommend the Cam Girl period, the podcast where Heron appears to die, There are a series of podcasts through the podcast recording of Stone Ape, and there are a number of really funny stories as well. I've gone back and listened to Stone Ape recently, and I'd certainly thoroughly recommend folks to check out Stone Ape. Heron and I don't think we'll ever record a podcast ever again. I think we've moved beyond that in both our kind of collective minds. But there are a lot of really funny stories, and there are a lot of good laughs through Stone Ape. And I'm genuinely appreciative that audio exists in some form that people can go back and listen to. I feel the same way about the Biota podcast as well. Lots of people go back and listen to the Biota podcast. Some of the audio is pretty poor, but that, I think, is a great podcasting series. And obviously Model Rail Radio continues as well. So you then have Short Funk. Short Funk got to the point where I was just sick of recording on the daily. And originally Short Funk was created in large part through Casey Neistat's work. And I was really interested when Casey Neistat started daily vlogging, that maybe by doing this thing on a daily basis, thinking in some regard that audio podcasts somehow equated to be similar to YouTube. Sadly, there are a number of problems associated with this naivety on my part, but let's just move forward on this idea. That if I could create content on a daily basis that people were listening to, then through word of mouth, this thing would actually create a somewhat interactive audience. And I think this is what I've always liked with podcasts, is to have an interactive audience as well. Certainly the thing that I love about Model Rail Radio, I certainly thoroughly enjoyed it with Biota and Stone Ape as well. And with Short Funk, because the topics were so scattershot, and they were all over the place. And they also had to do with my various, emotional things, right? If you're recording a daily podcast, you can't be happy and bright all the time. And certainly through the period of time where Stone Ape ended, and just the work commitments and a variety of other things, Short Funk became really difficult to produce. So I then went into a phase where I recorded 3 a week, and I got really far behind, and the whole thing just became drudgery. It became something that I didn't really want to do, and because there was no audience that I could appreciably see, I was appreciative that there were people that listened to it, but it didn't have a vibrant, interactive audience, and I think part of that was because I have very particular perspectives about a series of things, and listeners started to take exception to these things. So there were certain pet peeves that people had within the listenership to Short Funk, and these things just irritated them sufficient for them, I think, to stop listening, or at least to stop interacting. So as a body of work, Short Funk is there, and I'm actually really surprised going back to Short Funk and listening to it periodically, how good some of the Short Funks are. But there are also ones which aren't so good. There are also some filler episodes, and in general, I think it was an interesting kind of marathon-like effort to produce this much audio on a daily basis. And also, truth be told, and listeners to Short Funk, long-suffering listeners will know this, it wasn't always audio on a daily basis. It came in spurts and starts. I would record 4, 5 Short Funks in a row, and I'd just throw them in the feed. And then, 5, 6, 7 days later, I'd put another 5 in the feed. And these kind of patterns made me realize that it wasn't that I was abusing the listeners, it just wasn't an ideal format for me. So we then come to 2017. 2017, I'd ended a major podcast as far as I was concerned with the end of Stone Ape. And I thought, well, I've got a bit more podcasting time. What am I actually going to do with this time? What am I going to take away from what I've learned about podcasting to date? And initially, a listener to Stone Ape contacted me and said that his fiancée, I think they were fiancée at the time, maybe just girlfriend, potentially fiancée. Anyway, his partner was interested in recording a podcast. And although she had not listened to my back catalogue, which struck me as being interesting, potentially dangerous, but let's just say interesting, that she was interested in recording with me. And this became This Comes Next. Now, This Comes Next was a podcast idea that I had back in June 2016, maybe even earlier. The election and the lead up to the election, but also the fact that there was not necessarily political naivety, but just that no one, my education circa not really 1995, it was really circa 1982 through to 1995, but my political education was so far removed from the US. The way that I used left and right to actually mean something tangible, removing from 2 major political parties because there's no left in this country, right? There is no left in the US. If you understand what left and right means in a traditional political analysis, the candidacy of Hillary Clinton was a far-right candidate on everything. Globalization, every aspect. Hillary Clinton was a far-right candidate. So, in 2016 naivety, it was put to me that maybe I should record a political podcast. So at the time, I registered the domain name, This Comes Next. I created a logo, and then the tail end of the election happened, the US election. And I realized that this was just not an environment that I wanted to have any discourse in, because firstly, I was going to irritate what is ironic to even say out loud, but both sides, as if there were two sides here, as if there was an appreciably two different perspectives in the last election in the US, which from my perspective, there was no two sides. There was just a melees of kind of, there's a Peanuts character with the flies flying around the head, I just felt that was the whole thing associated with the last election, where there were no meaningful substantive issues that were discussed. You were just dealing with two nuts from different worlds, but mysteriously also dinner and lunch buddies 3 to 5 years ago, which was even more curious, that came out and did this thing which was in part performance art. And then there was a bunch of people that just got absolutely hysterical associated with what to me looked like basically similar candidates that had similar apocalyptic endgame scenarios in their thinking, and that was it. So how can you have a coherent and educated political discussion when the whole groundwork of political narrative bears no relationship to any aspect of reality? So I put This Comes Next to bed, and then Jay Kimono came along, and I thought, let's resurrect This Comes Next as an idea. Let's try to do this through nuanced fashion. But what This Comes Next has become, which is actually really quite curious, is a means of talking topically about things that are occurring in addition to politics. It's not that politics takes a backseat, but through this period of time as well, I found myself thrust into a variety of different areas that I have no particular business being in, but certainly particularly associated with this kind of Me Too abuse movement that is coming through. Somehow I've become part of this thing as well through a series of very curious things that I will talk about, no doubt, in a future podcast. So in a kind of March time frame, I think, through a long-standing connection associated with when I was working on, what was it called, the Best Damn Podcast Ever, the connections I made with the folks in Pennsylvania. One of them came here, got a tech job here, started attending my D&D night that I put on at Netflix on a monthly basis, sometimes every other week. And through this, he had a buddy back in Pennsylvania who wasn't really doing anything at the time and was interested in exploring audio podcasting, or at least somehow this thing came together, and it became a podcast called Attic Aficionados. Now, at some stage, through these recordings, I will talk a little bit more about Attic Aficionados as a phenomena. But let's just say it was a podcast that existed, I think, for about 17 episodes. So actually more recordings than This Comes Next currently. But through a series of factors, the podcast ended. And the podcast ended relatively dramatically and somewhat traumatically, and it's over. Very similar to Stone Ape. Stone Ape had some degree of nicety associated with the conclusion. Attic Aficionados didn't really have that. It just ended. So now I come to a position where I have a bit of podcasting time available. I have some writing projects I'm working on. I got a bunch of software projects I'm working on. But I'm wondering, do I have time for another podcast? And if I have time for another podcast, what format will this podcast take? And I looked back at Short Funk as an idea, and it wasn't that I had a problem with Short Funk as an idea, it's just that some topics I wanted to get into with a greater degree of nuance. Some topics I wanted to really explore. I wanted to dig deep within these topics with the benefit that in some kind of nuanced discussion, and my aim is to take roughly half an hour for each of these recordings, to really flesh out my thinking to the view that maybe I'll irritate some of my listeners, but my hope is that the listeners will go to the next one, or at least see that there's something decidedly different or just a different way of looking at something in the analyses that I will try to provide through this particular podcast recording. So what I wanted to do was provide an introduction to how I ended up here. There's a lot of additional nuances associated with collaborative effort, and I'm going to be recording at least one, if not two, podcasts on collaborative effort and my reflections on many years of working with people closely and then having very little to do with them, which seems to be just the way creative, intellectual folks just seem to work in this environment. What have I learned from my podcast to date? Well, I have an audience. I have an audience of varied and interesting people that I like creating audio for. And part of this is actually maintaining a voice. I mean, look, the option to stop podcasting altogether is always there. And I have a very particular view associated with monetizing podcasts, because the podcast industry is exactly the way you need to be making your money right now. I'm just not about that stuff. I've led a very, very lucky and curious life, and my ability to put audio out in a format where other folk can listen to it and get something from it is a luxury. And I do occasionally, out of the blue, meet people that listen to my audio, sometimes in an organized fashion, and it's always wonderful meeting listeners. So this is what Long Funk is going to be about. It's going to be taking some of the ideas from all these prior podcasts and producing audio in a fashion that I hope people will enjoy. I hope people will get some benefit out of. But really what I want to do is kind of trigger people's thinking to give a nuanced, in-depth look at a series of different topics and actually try to promote a degree of discourse as well. So when I talk about listener contribution, listener involvement, listener interest, we have a Facebook group that I've started already as a means of providing a mode of interaction for folks to enjoy the podcast, but also to ask questions, suggest topics, meet other like-minded folk that also listen to this irreverent stuff. And in that light, the Facebook group is probably a central point. I have registered the domain, I own the domain, I've moved everything over, the assets aren't quite there, but longfunk.com will be the landing point for this particular audio recording as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say buckle yourself in, but just get prepared for a series of out-there topics and an exploration which is never normative in fashion, oftentimes is purely instigatory. I'm Tom Barbley. I'm currently sitting in my podcasting room in San Jose, California, looking forward to offering you some new explorations through this new podcast.